America entered World War I with much different aspirations and interests than all other nations. Wilson announced that the world must be made safe for democracy and for people to live in peace. And that was the ambition of America, which differed greatly from all the other imperial nations who were pressing for conquest, colonies, and vengeance on the vanquished. No other world leader ever dared to put into place such an idealistic vision for a future devoted to world peace. But that vision was seen, and perhaps is, idealistic, impractical, and impossible. But Wilson championed it and fought with all he had to see it through, first in Europe and then back in America, to the point where he literally gave his life for it. But was such a vision really just fantasy, or was he ahead of his times? Well, that's the treasure we're out to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. Look over this cartoon and consider what it's saying about the League of Nations and President Wilson. The cartoon is simple but not subtle, criticizing Wilson's vision of the League of Nations as nothing more than a pipe dream, a fantasy, a bubble, birthed in his idealism. And that's what you're going to be asked to consider in today's story lecture. Was it just a bubble and a fantasy, or could the League of Nations have ushered in world peace if Wilson had had his way? So our exploration question is, why was President Wilson so devoted to the League of Nations? And why then did America refuse to sign it? So umbrellas out, because I got some history to rain upon you first. The Great War began in 1914, and it was slugged out over 4 grueling years that caused nearly 40 million casualties and took the lives of 20 million people, including a frightening number of civilians. America entered the fighting fields in the last 8 months of the war, and though America absolutely paid a frightful cost, it was much less than what the other major European powers experienced. European powers nearly lost a full generation of young men in the 4 years of war. Still yet, Wilson's goals for the war and the peace that followed were far more ambitious than all the other powers. He envisioned a peace without victory, meaning that even though the Allies won, they would not gain at the expense of the Central Powers. Wilson developed 14 points that outlined his goals for the peace conference. The points were designed to make good on his promise, a war to end all wars and to make the world safe for democracy. Many of the points related to ensuring independence and statehood for specific oppressed minorities like the Polish people, while others created a framework for global peace and cooperation amongst nations, like freedom of the seas so all nations could trade safely, an end to secret treaties and alliances, arms reductions, and lastly and most importantly for Wilson, the creation of an international organization called the League of Nations, designed to ensure peace and resolve conflicts without war. And when Wilson landed in Paris, he was celebrated as a hero by the people but received nothing but disdain from the leaders that he needed to work with. Wilson arrived in Paris in January of 1919 and was met with tens of thousands of cheering Parisians who greeted him as the champion of world peace that he hoped to become. One banner read, "Savior of Humanity," another, "Vive Wilson," and they shouted and raved like he was the Pope or, like one of the Beatles. Wilson took with him a delegation who shared a similar vision of his own, and he neglected to take a single Republican or senator that he would later need to work with. Foreshadowing! The Allied powers all gathered in Paris to hammer out the terms of the treaty. The Paris Peace Conference was made up of dozens of countries, but dominated by the Big Four: America under Wilson, Britain under Prime Minister Lloyd George, and Italy with some other guy that you're going to forget anyway, so I'll just save you the trouble. And to say that the other three didn't really see eye to eye with Wilson would be an understatement. Whereas Wilson pushed for peace without victory, the other powers that paid a much heavier price in blood and treasure were looking to capitalize on the victory. And more important than that, especially for France, to punish Germany and to cripple her so she could never make war again. But Wilson hoped to use the leverage he had to persuade them against seeking retribution and instead work for a lasting peace. Wilson's idealism was up against European realism, and the other big three were hoping not only to gain some of Germany's empire, and they also worried about their long-term security, and they believed it best to punish Germany harshly so that she remembered the cost and consequences of war and never invade again. Wonder how that's going to play out. Not good. Wilson remained in Paris for 6 months as they hashed out the treaty. He saw much of his 14 points and many of his goals get torn up and cast aside. In the final terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to pay intense reparations, give up territory, have strict limitations on its military, and accept war guilt. The war guilt clause humiliated Germany into admitting the war and all its horrors were her fault. Not exactly peace without victory. However, some of Wilson's points survived, including independence for many stateless peoples as the map of Europe and the Middle East were redrawn, an end to secret alliances, and most importantly, his League of Nations. Despite his compromises, Wilson believed that the League of Nations would in fact redeem everything that was wrong with the treaty. The League would be a body of the world's nations, large and small, that formed in order to promote international cooperation and to achieve international peace and security by the acceptance of obligations not to resort to war. It was a revolutionary change in world politics to foster greater cooperation, trade, and promote liberal ideals in a dark and war-torn world. Maybe there was some light and promise of a brighter future. Wilson signed the treaty in June of 1919, believing he had achieved his dream and legacy. But back at home, a Republican-controlled Senate led by Wilson's fiercest political rival was looking to pop Wilson's bubble. America has a long history of isolation and non-intervention. Dating back to George Washington's farewell address, he warned Americans to steer clear of permanent alliances. And for generations, his words were gospel. At the same time, though, many Americans were inspired by the idealism and the promise of a new world with Wilson's League. However, the Senate, which according to the Constitution must approve treaties by a 2/3 majority, had stiff reservations, and they were controlled at the time by Republicans and fierce opponents of Wilson. Most importantly, they worried about Article 10 of the League's covenant, which obligated members to defend nations experiencing external aggressions. Hence, Article 10 could supersede Congress's right to declare war, back when Congress still did that, and send American troops around the world to act as a police force. This clause was absolutely worrisome for America's independence, but was it necessary to ensure a future without war? That was the choice the Senate and the nation was debating. So Wilson, who refused to take a single Republican and senator with him to Paris, now had to plead to their good graces and his arch rival, a strict isolationist Henry Cabot Lodge, to accept the Treaty of Versailles, and with it, his League. Wilson returned home exhausted by war and the peace process, but he delivered a speech to the Senate demanding that they sign the treaty, and with it the League of Nations, being the only hope of mankind. But Lodge disagreed. As he put it, the US is the world's best hope, but if you fetter her in the interests and quarrels of other nations, if you tangle her in the intrigues of Europe, you will destroy her power for good and endanger her very existence. And the Senate actually offered many amendments to the treaty and showed a willingness to compromise, but Wilson refused to budge. On the area of most contention, Wilson would not compromise, stating the Senate must take their medicine. Not exactly a sentiment that fostered productive dialogue. And that brings us to Dad Jokes in History! Why was Henry Cabot Lodge and other Republican senators opposed to the League of Nations? Let's have it. They felt that they were being mistreated. Come on, that was pretty good. But if you got a better one, let's see it below. But fed up with Lodge and the Senate, Wilson decided to take his case directly to the American people, who could then pressure their senators to support the treaty and thus the League. Although utterly exhausted, he would muster all the energy he could to cement his legacy of world peacemaker and savior of mankind. To huge gathering crowds, he warned of the dangers of future wars with modern weapons, and that bad guys don't stay in their neighborhoods, that if not confronted and pressured, war again would come for the peace-loving peoples of the world. The intensity of Wilson's tour, 8,000 miles in just 3 weeks, giving 40 impassioned speeches without microphones or speakers, took its toll on him. And after delivering one of his finest speeches of his life in Pueblo, Colorado, Wilson collapsed. He was rushed to get medical attention. Speaking with his personal physician who urged him to stop the tour and just get some rest, Wilson stated, "I do not want to do anything foolhardily, but the League of Nations is now in its crisis. And if it fails, I hate to think what would happen to the world. I cannot put my personal safety, my health in the balance against my duty. I must go." Days later, though, he suffered a stroke that would leave him bedridden for pretty much the rest of his life. Even though he could inspire and motivate every crowd on his tour, it did not do enough to move a weary Congress. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, and thus America did not join on to the League of Nations. Wilson was bedridden and nearly paralyzed and could do nothing but watch as his brainchild was rejected by his own country. It was a rejection of Wilsonian idealism and interventionism, and an embrace of traditional isolationism that would define America's foreign policy for the next 2 decades. Even without the leadership or participation of America, the League went on, but it proved futile and ultimately incapable of preventing military aggression when the clouds of war darkened in both the East and the West. As the Japanese, Italian, and German war machines began grinding into gear, the League fell apart. And it would take another world war, another 80 million deaths, another generation of lost men for America to take on Wilson's vision with the United Nations. And this time America would play a leadership role in the institution. But that question that the Senate and the nation were wrestling over seems more important than ever today. What responsibility do we have to the world? And what limitations, if any, are we willing to put on our independence to ensure peace? And whatever we decide, you can bet that history will be there waiting. So thanks for engaging in some today. This has been History for Humans. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching. It really means a lot, but it would mean even more if you just took a sec and clicked the thumb right there that looks like this, and you can hit the subscribe button too. Go ahead. I'll wait. I got time. I'm a history teacher. Thanks. And for teachers and homeschool parents, you can head over to my website, historyforhumans.com, and you can grab lessons and resources that go with all of my videos, because if you're doing the learning activity that goes with this episode, hang out because I got instructions in just a sec. Alright guys, got some awesome cartoons for you to analyze today and some really juicy documents for you to read. Delicious, nutritious, and 100% organic. So the big question that you're going to be wrestling with today is who had it right, Wilson or Lodge? You're first going to analyze a couple of political cartoons to understand the attitudes on the League of Nations in greater depth than the video covered. You're going to answer some quick questions on the cartoons, and then you're going to read 2 short speeches from Wilson and Lodge. You're going to pick 2 powerful quotes from each, write them down, and then respond on what you take away from each of those quotes. What are they saying and what does it make you think about? And then lastly, the big question that you really should be thinking critically about, because it's an important one. Should America have joined the League of Nations? As you write your argument, use evidence from at least one of the documents, but feel free to tap into both. And I want you guys to drop an anvil on this one and crush it.